Cool. So first, I want to tell you guys a quick story that just happened last night, and it'll loop back into psychology. So my friend and I, we went to the beach in New Hampshire, and we actually just like parked, ran right into the water, and just got swept right out by one of the strongest riptides I've ever seen.
What?
And I realized it before he did. I said, I can't believe I can't touch right here. And I looked back at the beach, and it was way further than it should be. And I started swimming, and I wasn't going anywhere, but he kept getting swept out. And so I said, hey, like I'm going back. And I started swimming, and I'm like getting like 1 yard per minute closer to the beach. And I'm like, hey, like we need to go back like right now. And there's like very few people on the beach. Two people are maybe within earshot, but they're walking away. I'm like, oh no, this could be bad. I need to get like some people's attention. So I start saying, hey, help. They stop and they just start staring. And it probably looks pretty silly like that. I'm swimming, but I'm not going anywhere. And I probably said, hey, help like 5 times. And then finally I see people running around, and I'm thinking, at this point, I can't see my friend Manuel. He's like swept out to sea, and these like big rollers. And I'm like, do I go back for him or do I go straight toward the beach? And I never once dawned on me that I need to swim parallel to the beach, perpendicular to the rip, even though if I was to take like a test, I could tell you that. But in that moment, it did not dawn on me. So I'm swimming hard straight towards the beach. Finally, someone comes out in the water, and they kind of like are waist deep where it's safe. And I felt very kind of encouraged by that someone was like there to usher me in. So I beat the rip. I make it back. And then, yeah, Manuel makes it back. And Manuel, basically, we had like 4 or 5 people telling Manuel, like, hey, go that way, go that way. But he could not swim parallel to the beach. He just kept going straight for the beach. And I asked him after, did you hear us? And he said, yeah, I heard you, but I just kept swimming straight toward the beach. It was like a fixation. So I want to bring that up because you guys talk about psychology and governance structure. So I'm interested, like, what is the governance structure of the human psyche?
Well, I really think this is an interesting question because I think that different cultures and different individuals aspire for different governance structures within their psyche. And this can lead to very different ways of interacting. Specifically, and some people like us, like Simone and I, we aspire for a very dictatorial internal governance structure where we say everything should be subservient to the logic part of our brain. Whereas right now there's been a movement, especially within the meditation movement, especially within like I think the types of stuff that your audience is probably into, to try to make your brain sort of a democracy of the different forces and voices within the brain, some of which could be more spiritually motivated, some of which could be tied to certain types of intuition, some of which could be tied to specific emotions, and trying to come to answers where all of the voices within your head are in harmony with each other. Another thing to really remember when we're talking about this, in one of our episodes, the You're Probably Not Sentient episode, we also talk about that the human mind has an illusion of cohesion. So my background was in neuroscience. That's what I originally did. So even though we perceive our mental processes as happening totally cohesively and unifiedly, they're actually sort of happening separately from each other. You can almost think of them as happening within like different districts. And then they try to stitch them together right before they leave your brain. So the answer then is, what's the optimal structure? Like, I guess I was just saying there that this idea of, oh, I'm just one thing, I don't really need to worry about how I govern my head. I think that's a valuable question because you do need to worry about it. And the answer is it depends on what you're optimizing for and how you believe you exist as an identity. Like, what is the meaningful aspect of your identity? And then that judges that answer. I think that really messes kids up when they undergo no sort of physical or emotional hardship. And I think within our existing culture, people don't really have frameworks for dealing with that. So they grow up, they begin to experience their first hardships, and they just sort of treat it like it's this huge blaring alarm that like must be all they focus on and build their identity around. And so I think, well, could I combine this with a coming of age ritual? And so we've talked with other families about things like, well, could we like buy some land? Like this was our plan, right? Buy some land in like northern Canada or something, basically rig the whole thing with cameras so we can actually watch the kids, keep an eye out for bears and stuff like that in case they come into the area. But otherwise, you know, let the kids basically learn to live on their own there as a group for maybe like a summer. I think that would be a really efficient ritual that would give the kids, because it would also, I mean, one of the points of these rituals as well is that the kids feel like they've undergone some sort of a challenge, which has proved to themselves that they're self-sufficient.
And we acknowledge that this is basically Hunger Games without the battle royale element.
Oh, you know, my thoughts on this is skip the cameras. If they find one camera, it would like ruin the experience. So I did 2 Outward Bound trips. Have you guys heard of Outward Bound?
Yeah.
Yep. So I did one when I was 18, just graduated high school, and we went out there and like climbed some pretty big mountains in Oregon, did some whitewater rafting, flipped the raft, like hardcore stuff, like very dangerous. And it was great. It was definitely a coming of age thing for me. And the only thing with Outward Bound is in like the middle of the wilderness, they start indoctrinating you into like gender ideology. So I think we can
is that
skip
what Outward Bound does now?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Oh, I didn't know. I mean, my family was involved with Outward Bound a long time ago. And I did it a couple times as a kid. I didn't like how on rails the experience felt. I feel like maybe it didn't used to be so on rails.
I think
I don't know what I did as a kid, like out of Oakland, was like if we would have died on the trip we went on, we would have like, I mean, not died, but like become injured, we would have died because of how like remote we were up a creek. So I don't know. I think some of them are still off the rails for sure.
Wow, it's very interesting here. You guys have both done Outward Bound experiences. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't know if mine was Outward
used
Bound
to be on the board
branded
or something.
Something similar, I guess. But
Similar.
I think all the Outward Bound schools are a little bit different. But in Oregon or in the Northwest, yeah, it's some pretty hardcore trips.
I really like the idea of this, like putting the group of kids in northern Canada on their own and then giving them some like raw materials periodically. So it's like, yes, you can hunt, yes, you can forage, but we're going to give you like some basic cooking stuff at like bi-weekly increments. So you can find it here in the dead drop and then you can go.
No, you got to have them earn it. Like that's why you say the camera.
That's why it's like the Hunger Games.
Yeah, and if you complete certain tasks, then you earn certain materials so that they know they're being watched and they're being given certain tasks, but they have to figure out how to complete them among themselves to like get cooking pots and stuff.
Yeah, we're big believers in the Hawthorne effect. For those not familiar with it, there was this like, I think it was in the early 1900s. There was this study done on, I think it was women working in like a factory setting, and they were trying at first to just determine what the effect of lighting was on them. So like they turned the lighting higher and their productivity went up, and then they turned the lighting way lower and their productivity went up. And they finally discovered that really what was going on was these women knew that they were being watched and monitored, and therefore their performance, like that changed the effect of their work. So like we're really interested personally in being like free range parents, but with the Hawthorne effect. So our children are free range. They're free to do what they want. They're free to like wander around, but they also know that we're watching, and that affects how they decide. You know, people think very differently when they know that there are eyes on them, when there's a camera on them, than when they're like acting with impunity. And we think that that's actually a worthwhile thing to do, but we may be messing up our kids even more than people think we already are.
I want to talk a little bit more about your cultural religious group that you're building, aka Cultivar, and you're talking about this coming of age ritual. Do you incorporate prayer rituals or rituals?
So we do not. I do think that fasting rituals are included in almost every. So one of the things we note in our book is pretty much every older tradition has some sort of arbitrary self-denial ritual, you know, whether it's Ramadan or Lent or Feast of the Firstborn. And our guess is that this helps build up the prefrontal, in the prefrontal cortex, there's things called inhibitory pathways, which are specific pathways in the brain used to shut down intrusive thoughts or like ideas. It's like how you tell your brain off or no. Like that actually requires sort of like a mental muscle, you could say. And if you are not used to doing that, that mental muscle can atrophy and it can be very hard to say no. So like it clearly has positive psychological effects to do this. We aren't not doing it because like we think it's good to not do it. We just haven't gotten around to coming up with something yet is more the answer. Simone, do any of our holidays involve self-denial other than the one where we take their gadgets and stuff?
No, but it's built into our family. Like we only eat one family meal a day.
Oh yeah. So it's built in. So this is that's a good way to put it. So it's a bit different than an independent ritual. It's more built into the family tradition of how are you supposed to show your worth within the family. Like what is our internal honor system? Because I think a lot of families have that. Like, how do you show you're a good person? And one of the ones that we are very clear on is extreme frugality and self-deprivation when, like, for example, in the winter, we don't heat our house barely ever. And Simone walks around in like a big ski suit and stuff like that, you know, so we're usually well below 50 degrees.
Wow.
So like 30 sometimes. We try to live with that. Now, for the second question, the prayer systems, no, we haven't invented any sort of a prayer system. I don't know if one of the things we're really careful about is I have seen other people try to create rituals for their kids or like religious things within like their sort of San Francisco group or whatever, you know, and they become sort of hokey woo stuff that I think kids would find very distasteful. So when I think about something like a prayer, I'm like, is that something that's going to engage kids? I don't think I can independently engage kids with that. Whereas if it's something like, a gift exchange ceremony, I think that's something that they would remember and pass on. I think what we could probably do other than prayer is some sort of ritualized journaling. That would be very similar to prayer. But I think it would come off as less hokey to kids and have more obvious utility. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
We've discussed a lot of future orientation instead, like recorded weekly. Here's what my goals are. Here's how I did last week.
We are going to do that.
So
I
yeah,
guess
there
that's
are
like prayer.
Yeah, there are ritualized things that we are doing that are oriented around our values, and our values are very much oriented around self-control and future orientation. So there is that. One of our holidays involves making pledges to. We practice descendant worship, so pledges to like people living thousands and thousands of years in the future, and like that could be seen as a prayer, but like I probably by most people's standards not.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And the last question I have on this topic would be, I think about the Amish, and one of the things about that I like about them is their clear process for pairing and procreating, and the dating. Just it's so simple. And in our culture, in the mainstream urban monoculture, it's very much not simple. Nobody even really knows what the rules are.
So if you haven't talked about Amish dating on your podcast, why don't you go into that for a second?
Well, I'm actually planning on going to live with the Amish this fall, so I'm going to learn more and I will report back. But I've only read a book on them so far, so
well, I'd love to hear more. I'm not familiar with their dating ritual.
Okay, so from what I understand, they kind of, it's like the group kind of like agrees, oh, these two people should get together, and then the man comes and picks up the woman, and he like makes his horse and buggy look as nice as he possibly can, and he picks her up and they ride around together, and then they go to the house and they just talk, and they maybe like play a board game, and then I think this happens after church on Sunday. And so after church, they pair off and they go and they talk for a while, and then they do that a few times, and then they decide like if they have an understanding or if they want to keep going.
So other people suggest them as a potential match, and
I
then
think
they vet each other.
I think everyone's aware of who's pairing up on Sunday after church, and so everyone's kind of like cool with that, and then they get together and they basically just talk and play board games.
Yeah, we're building intentional dating institutions already. I mean, one of the big ones that we're working on right now It's sort of in the background. We'll put a lot more effort into it after the school is live. Is going to be like a new London season. So we're sort of getting together accomplished, intelligent people who are looking to marry to once a year all fly to the same city and do a number of parties, basically. And which city is going to host this? We'll have cities bid on it, sort of like you would have for the Olympics. And then so it's not actually cities bidding on it. It's more like families within cities, like wealthy families that want to like show off their city because, you know, of the types of people who would go to this, you know, we look at where we have our inroads right now with like Teal Fellows and like some wealthy families and stuff like that in various countries that are really interested in like, oh, I want to marry my daughter off to some Silicon Valley, you know, upstart type guy. No, it's a good matching system, right? You know, and so I think that we sorted out the logistics of how this will work. We just don't have anybody operating it yet. But that's what we're looking at doing because it would artificially increase switching costs. And we could say, oh, like we could just arrange marriages for our kids. But I think that would be rather ineffective given the size of our cultural group and a huge downside to the Amish system, which I think isn't, it doesn't matter as much within their culture, but would matter within our culture is that it is, you know, the chance, like if I was forced to marry somebody from the high school I went to, like their communities are big, but not that big, right? Even the single best match person for me would be a pretty terrible match. So when you're dealing with weird outliers, you're just, or not even weird outliers, I would say most exceptional people, you're just not going to have good matches from them within these small population sets. And you need a system for scouring larger population sets for very well matched individuals.
So my question is, how do you keep your cultural religious group hard and intact through generations if you have people marrying people in faraway places and moving into faraway places? How does that?
Well, I think the key is the money. That was what we were sort of doing with the Pragmatist Guide to Governance. Is there needs to be, well, not money exactly, but there needs to be some concrete advantage to staying within your cultural group. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is to have a very unique family office that is not a family office that distributes money, but one of the ways you gain voting power within the family office is essentially investing into the family office, or you can gain additional voting power by having more kids. It has 3 voting branches. We don't need to get too deep into it. The point being is that the family office takes money from the various family members and then provides services for the family writ large. Those services can be things like education, stuff like that, dating, you know, helping them run these dating institutions we're talking about, et cetera. And cultural clout that would help within dating markets and stuff like that. Now, where this becomes relevant is it would become difficult, and also investment in companies and stuff that the kids do if they can get outside investors. So it makes a lot of their lives a bit easier, but they have to stick with the family traditions to have access to it. To some extent. Now, they can change the family traditions, but those are done through voting power within the family office. So that's the way we're thinking about doing it, is to ensure that there is some hard benefit to staying within the family tradition.
How far society's gone in a direction that is extremely toxic out of men's favor. And that's not to say that for, you know, huge portions of human history, women in marriages have been, you know, at an extreme disadvantage and, you know, put in really bad positions. That totally has happened. But we're also now seeing, you know, an age in which I think it's gone way too far the other way.
I used to feel that way for a little while, where I was just like, I think I'm kind of done with this whole relationship thing. I don't really see this panning out too well, so I'm just going to do my own thing over here. But I came back to it, and what I noticed in giving it a bit of absence and in beginning to associate myself with some more conscious communities or people who actually do a bit of meditation, do a bit of self-help, who actually have done some work on themselves, is like, oh, there actually are a bunch of incredible women out there. I just wasn't necessarily, you know, encountering them. I wasn't even really the person who could interact that great with a wonderful woman a couple of years ago. So I had to do some work on my end, and then I needed to start placing myself in circles where I could find valuable and incredible women.
I think this is just such a critical point here that a lot of guys miss, is they can get the impression that all women are terrible if the lure they're using, if the way they are attracting women is attracting a specific type of woman. And unfortunately, the easiest to learn pickup strategies disproportionately attract the worst types of women. So
Yep.
if what you are offering to a woman is, I have frame, I am, dark triad, I am, like the red pill is right. That turns women on, right? But if you are dating the kind of woman who goes out with a guy because he turns her on, but is otherwise clearly bad for her long-term, like mental health and interests, that's going to filter for like the most abusey, fragile thought you could imagine. She is literally choosing her sexual gratification over literally every other type of interest she may have. And what I'm hearing in this new community is now you're sourcing partners by who are specifically interested in you, maybe not because you're hot, but because you're working on yourself and you're working on different aspects of yourself. And they're like, oh, that's something I'm doing. Let's work on that together. And that's a completely different type of relationship lure. They are not drawn to you for sexual gratification. They are drawn to you because you're on a life path of self-improvement together. And that will allow your relationships to be so much more likely to not turn into this lady on the plane.
Yeah, I think we need even more places like the yoga community, like health and wellness retreats, like where people who are working themselves on themselves and like seeking a better future, like where those people can meet up. And perhaps the new London season thing is just what I'm talking about. So, Luke, did you have something?
Yeah, well, there's such a difference in attitude between two subsets of people. One is I'm looking for someone to meet my sexual needs and like that's what I'm interested in. The second is I'm looking for someone who can support me in becoming more of who I really am. And it's like when you find that person, and there's probably more women who have adopted that outlook than men, but I think men are catching up. There's more of us out there. But if you can put two of those people together, then you're really in for a fulfilling life, because then when you get triggered by each other, it's not just how dare you, what have you done? It's what are you showing me that it's actually valuable? And now we actually can move through it and maybe become better individuals, a better couple.
Oh, absolutely. And this is one area where we really disagree with like the traditional, I guess, manosphere perspective on what a good woman is, where they will be like, oh, a good woman is somebody who is obedient. Whereas, like you were saying, I think if you want a woman, for me at least, like a woman who would actually fulfill me, it's a woman who it wants me to become the same type of person I want to become, and who will push me and call me out when I fail to meet that in a way that I respect her enough that I know that she's legit, and I should be ashamed if I'm not living up to the goals that she has for me. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about as well. And it's really cool when both of you feel that way about each other, like you're training buddies, more than but there's this whole, I believe, dynamic or false understanding of masculinity within certain parts of the online community, that masculinity is in part defined by never admitting that a woman can tell you how to improve yourself.
Guys, where do you get like a lot of your information? Like I've seen these like big research papers that you do on like pronatalist.org and Collins Institute. How do you do research? Is question,
Simone, do you
like
want to go?
thoughts
You're
on
the
that?
one who tells me all my information.
No, it's not true. I don't know. We consume books, definitely, but I consume them and then I summarize them for Malcolm. Malcolm like consumes all
YouTube.
like
Lots of YouTube.
just like
I mostly get most of my
YouTube.
learning today from YouTube. Historically, I got my learning from the Teaching Company. If anybody, I used to like binge constantly Teaching Company.
They still
material.
are amazing.
They're still amazing. I haven't listened to them in a couple of years now, but I used to listen to like easily like 8 hours a day of Teaching Company material. So that's great if you want to get college level lectures that you can just like absolutely annihilate and burn through and get like 10 college degrees in a much shorter time.
And then for scientific research, I'm obsessed with now. Like I love illicit.org because it's like sort of
an AI where you can ask it questions.
It's an AI powered search engine for peer reviewed research. So it allows you to ask a question and it will give you like summaries of the research. It's almost like it does a meta study for you, imperfectly, obviously, but it allows you to then click through and look at the abstracts while also summarizing them. You can even do a little Q&A with the research itself, which is so awesome.
And
So,
Another
yeah.
really cool thing that we do. So she also used to read, I forgot the reviews, but there were like lists of like interesting new studies that she would be on. And she would tell me when any of them like was, and she built master docs of all of these studies as well.
Yeah,
She would
I
just be
still
like, oh,
have
these are
them.
all the studies that changed my mind on something. But another thing that we did is morning strategy walks, where we take an hour-long walk every morning. And on those, one of the rules that Simone set for me is, because I wake up earlier than her to work, is by the time she wakes up every morning, I have to have some new interesting thing I've learned to discuss with her. The best way to learn is how you structure your social relationships. It is the person you're dating or married to is a core aspect of your relationship. Well, we always need to have something new to talk about, so make sure you scour studies so we can go over that. You are going to build up information and thoughts about that information so much faster than if, books. But also that goes to the thing we were talking about earlier, which is be with somebody who pushes you forwards in various ways. Some communities that are based where the internal hierarchy of the community is based around quote unquote intelligence, what that can subconsciously create is a motivation, because if you mention a study that everyone else in the community already knows, like it's a commonly known study, you can get shamed. Like, don't you know everybody already knows that? Which creates a subconscious motivation to disproportionately air and talk about fringe studies. And this has happened like hugely within the rationalist and less wrong community, where a combination of that and tyranny of the unemployed, which we talked about earlier, has caused them to basically become sort of idiot communities when they used to be like really, really smart places, because they had internal social structures based on like research. And so I think that when you do this, it's important that you are around friends who are just like genuinely curious and never respond to any sort of like, here's information or here's data. It was like, oh, I already knew that, because then they're like fronting on you, but like riffing on, oh, and here's a study that went along with that. Like, that's the way our friend group right now is, that I'm really
Right.
excited about. And it
I would just
yeah.
potentially add that your friend group might not be representative of what a lot of other of people might be experiencing. I like in my experience, like bringing up any kind of study or referencing like scientific stuff is like, it's kind of weird. Like, you'd be the oddball in the group for even bringing up like a peer-reviewed study. They'd be like, that's something we do in school. Like, we're not in school right now, so why are you talking about that? But no, I was always intellectually curious on my own. I watched probably 10,000 YouTube videos, and what really helped me was a Chrome extension called Distraction Free YouTube, where I could modify YouTube and what pops up.
Yes, I've heard of this. It's a good recommendation algorithm.
So the only YouTube videos I'm watching are things that I search for, and I also am not subjected to advertisements, which is good as well. But I think you have to be absolutely ruthless in this kind of memetic environment with how you set up your memetic environment. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, and the local hierarchy structure, which is just something that I think people should pay more attention to. When you're around your friends, try to note what determines the internal social hierarchy of the group and how is the group fronting to each other, because that will determine a lot in regards to where you transform as a person.
And I think that's a really important part of life, is understanding that what you believe may change, what you value even may change based on better information that you get. And that doesn't mean that you're wrong. And if you are wrong, you really should be right, right? So when you find something that's offensive, when you find something that potentially threatens your worldview, rather than turn away, rather than be offended or be defensive, it's really important to engage with those ideas and really find out, am I wrong? And it's very scary to do that. It's very scary to feel like your entire worldview, your entire identity is in threat or under threat. But again, we really, really want to be corrected if we're wrong. And one of the reasons why we're really bullish on kids is sometimes adults just can't change that much. They just can't get past that. And the really awesome thing about kids is you can raise a slightly different iteration of you with all the exposure to your worldview and ideas. And if they decide that you are wrong, and they have the ability to do that much more easily than you do in your ossified adult state, then voila, they will do whatever is right, hopefully. So we're really excited about the idea that many of our children will live by very different values, very different, worldviews, and with very different lifestyles, because maybe they're more right than we are. we also plan on, like, neither of us have ever taken psychedelics ever. But we tactically plan to change that policy when we hit an age at which we discovered that it is harder for us to change our minds, because the research that we've seen indicates that it does make you a lot more open-minded and more creative, more flexible. There is a trade-off because it also can make you more gullible. This it's a natural problem. So like we do tactically really believe in this, but there are complications to it. It's an imperfect game to play, right?
Our views on AI are a little orthogonal to most. We believe sufficiently intelligent AIs all converge into a single optimization function and behavior pattern. And so the only real AI risk comes from all the AIs from between now and then. But those AIs between now and then are both, we don't know what they're going to do. They could do a lot of things that completely change everything. Or the in-state AI, I don't think that we can conceive what this entity will think like, because I think it'll be an entity thousands of times smarter than us, and we can't really easily guess what its objective function is going to be. I took a shot at it in our book, but I don't know. If we're talking about like human population patterns, like people are like, how can you predict the economy is going to collapse? It's like, because that's obvious. That's like the most obvious of obvious
I'm
things.
not questioning that. I'm questioning how can you predict the repercussions of that? Like how do you know that even like the U.S. government is going to like maintain the monopoly on violence, like with total economic collapse? It just seems to me like you can't really predict what comes after that. But I don't know.
Well, you can predict a few things. You can't predict everything, but you've got to think, okay, what's relevant for my family, right? So from the perspective of your family, you're trying to guess a few things. You're trying to guess, what are you going to have access to? What is the surrounding geopolitical situation going to be like? Like, those are the two key things, right? Like,
Right.
So is the US government going to have more power than it has now? It is possible, but if it does, it will likely signal it first in the same way that China has for its citizens and give you a chance to get out. Will it be true that every single government everywhere in the world will have more power than it has today? No, I can say with confidence there will be some areas of the world that you can migrate to that will be less controlled than most of today's governments, just due to population collapse in regions like Europe and stuff like that, and being able to just settle islands out there and stuff. So that's why we don't really plan on that, because I don't plan on my descendants living in an area with one of these really high government control regions. The next question is access to supplies. I think that there's a few things that we can say with high predictability might get harder to access. Complicated semiconductors are very hard to make. Only a few places in the world can make them. And they're used in a lot of the social structure and technology we have. But then there's other things that just aren't as hard to make as people think, like bullets, guns, uncomplicated semiconductors. So a lot of the things in the world I think we'll continue to have. It'll just be more like a developed country. Also, we can look at other countries in the world for simulacrums of like where the future is going to go in different economic situations, right? And be like, if my preparations would allow me to get out of a country like Venezuela, they would allow me to get out of a country like US, no matter how bad it gets, so long as we have systems in place for recognizing that it's getting bad before it gets bad. For a lot of this stuff, you're like, do you have material supplies? I think that historically, we have looked at certain types of scarce things as things of value that just won't exist everywhere in the world in the future. Land, for example. Land, it constantly increased in value historically because the population was increasing exponentially. In a world where the population is decreasing exponentially, land has almost no value and semiconductors have all the value. So there's a lot of things that can sort of change in value. And so a lot of this, you could say, how can you predict these specific outcomes? It's not that you're predicting specific outcomes. It's that you're saying, in a scenario in which population collapse continues and the economy collapses in Y way, I can say for certain that these types of assets will increase in value. And if I build my descendants to have these types of assets, they'll be good. But if the economy collapses in Z way, my descendants will have Z types of values. But if, and I think this is important, people are like, what if the economy doesn't collapse? What if AI stabilizes everything? It's like, then I don't need to worry about my descendants, right? So I don't need to prep in those ways.
I like the analogy you guys use about the Titanic is we're on the Titanic. We can clearly see the iceberg, but most people are inside partying and they don't want to even acknowledge the iceberg because then they would stop partying. But you guys are on the deck getting the lifeboats ready. And actually, it's kind of more fun and fulfilling to be the ones getting the lifeboats ready than to be the ones inside blindly drinking. But where I want to go with this is the economic ramifications. And even before the population really starts dropping big time, the market is going to start pricing that in. And I'm wondering about like the market psychology around this. How is a market going to price a company that only operates in a country that's going to go down like 90% in population, like South Korea? Are like stocks?
A good model you can look at is Detroit. I'd look at the housing market of Detroit if you want to get an understanding of how this psychological phenomenon plays out. Because I think a lot of people were very confused as to how a house in Detroit could sell for $1, right? And it's when an asset costs money to maintain and is always decreasing in value, it will decrease to almost nothing very quickly. And that means you would have a mass outflow of money from the stock market. But I'd also point out to people that markets can maintain delusions for much longer than any remotely rational person would think. And like a good example of this, right, that I always go to is if you're I don't know if this is still true, but it was true like 5 years ago. If I was buying land in Florida, right, a 30-year loan on like an atoll would be priced the same as a 30-year loan in the center of Florida, which is insane because everybody knows, like even conservatives admit now that the sea level is rising. I mean, what's causing it to rise or whatever, but those atolls aren't going to be there in 30 years. Why is it being priced the same? And it's just like the market hasn't adjusted yet. Now, I heard that recently it does adjust because you have to buy insurance on it and the insurance prices in the change. But this wasn't the case back then. So the point being is it's just wild how long it can take the market to react. What happens when the market does start to react? A lot of things start to break. And then the only places it really makes sense to have your money is in cultural groups that are rising in population and are technophilic. And so by that, what I mean is, Simone, reminder, our Israel investment strategy. If we haven't deployed that, make a note. No, but that's an example of an area that's technophilic and rising in population and would make sense to invest. And you can actually even see this in like property values, so like property values that surround Amish communities have behaved in like really weird ways and like are uniquely good. Because like there's always people leaving the communities looking to buy property, which just isn't true of the rest of society anymore. Whereas people are like, wait, if population is shrinking, why is property going up so much? Which is a very interesting thing. And it shows how markets can behave in weird ways you didn't expect. It is because family units are dissolving at the same time. Right. And that's part of what's causing the markets to shrink. So houses that used to go to 5 people living in them together, a husband, a wife, a kids, maybe a parent, they're now being held by single people. And so you're basically adding a multiplier to the number of houses you need for the same population.
Well, I would just add to that even in the apartment market, like a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom apartment go for almost the same price. Yeah. Which is fascinating.
Well, it shows the level of demand for 2-bedroom apartments.
Exactly.
Which is it's marginally not that high. A lot of the real estate market now is for these people who are living alone.
Single people, yeah. But I want to talk more about the Amish. So you brought up the real estate market and how investing in cultural religious groups that are growing is like the best place to put your money, it sounds like. And but you talk about you say technophilic cultural religious groups, but then you reference the Amish. And I actually don't think of the Amish as technophobic or technophilic. I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. I think of them as techno-selective, and they're very cautious and they like to be late to adopt technologies because they want to see how these technologies affect the other people first. And I think that's a smart strategy. And I do think that's probably a good place to invest is in Amish communities. Like you actually live in Pennsylvania. So
no, that's a
perhaps not
solid
that far.
investment. Amish communities are a solid investment, like being around those communities and stuff like that.
Are you
That
near
said, I
them?
would no, their fertility rates are crashing right now.
And we've heard that when they do start adopting technology, there does start to be cultural, lifestyle, mental health, productivity erosion, also birth rate erosion. Right.
So there was a great study that was looking at high fertility rates for Dutch, Pennsylvania and Dutch. This is Amish speaking people, so that's the language they speak. And what the study found very interestingly is they only had these high fertility rates if speaking Pennsylvania Dutch was combined in the data was not owning cell phones. They are just as affected by cell phones as everyone else. They were just starting from a higher position in regards to fertility rate, but it's actually going down just as much as anyone else. So what we have learned about the Amish strategy is it is only successful at motivating fertility rates when it is complete. Second, even if there was some iteration of the Amish community which survived and was techno-selective, I can say the two technologies that are going to define the future, like who wins in the future, which cultural groups win, are going to be genetic selection technologies and AI technologies. And I can say with absolute certainty that Amish are not going to adapt AI or genetic selection anywhere in the near future. Given our world perspective, the information we have access to, I can say, okay, this is definitively the highest probability course of outcome given that knowledge, and I will prepare using that information. And I think that, as Simone pointed out, that's a unique cultural perspective. And there's other cultures that will say, if I don't have over X% confidence, it doesn't matter just choosing the highest confidence answer out of a number of answers. What matters is having at least 80% confidence. And if I have less than that, then I won't do anything to prepare for an outcome.
I like this concept of, pragmatism of taking actions versus remaining in stasis or in response. So at least, at worst, you've taken the wrong action, but you've predisposed yourself toward the taking of actions. And then so now you can take another action which, when perhaps everyone else is still just reeling in horror at the arrival of something unexpected.
One of the things that I found fascinating that I learned from you guys was about how the small towns are set up. They finance their sewer system and the water system.
Oh, yeah.
And when you don't have enough taxpayers, what then? What happens then? Actually that people may just leave that town, and then we could see a lot of ghost towns, ghost cities, and even ghost countries. And you talk about how Africa still has high birth rates. And so I'm wondering if we could see like a Black South Korea, basically. It's just a fascinating future to kind of project in our minds. Like that's how weird things are going to get. My big thing is the next 50 years are not going to be smooth emailing. I think
Well, and something I'd remind people of is people in Africa don't have a lot of kids because they're Africans. They have a lot of kids because they're poor. When they move to other countries, their fertility collapses just as much or more than every other cultural group. The groups that are resistant to fertility collapse in the face of prosperity are at the high end Jews, conservative Jews, just off the charts resistant. But then after them, you're actually typically talking about white Christian conservatives. That's the next most resistant group. So the groups that get affected least by this are conservative whites and Jews, largely speaking, which I think just goes against a lot of intuitions people have about what's going on.
Wow, this was an epic podcast. Is there anything else you want to bring up, Luke or Simone?
Check out Basecamp, guys, please. It's our new podcast. We're trying to get people to putting a lot of work into it.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, you guys have an incredible podcast, and you have great guests on.
This was really, really awesome speaking with both of you, and the thoughtful approach you take to so many different things is it's really.
And
inspiring.
we'll definitely let you know if we're through New Hampshire, by the way, because
yes.
I go up to Maine, about once a year, so
100%. Yeah, we should definitely link up in person. That'll be fun.
Thank you both so much for being here and for a great conversation. And to everyone,
have a spectacular day, you guys.